Hey guys, tonight we drift back 5 centuries across the rough strait between Kyushu and the China coast, into a world where the sea is a night road, and every lantern on the water might be a promise or a trap. Japan is splintered by the Sengoku Jidai warlords colliding, castles flaring like torches, vassals changing crests when the wind shifts. You are one of the leftovers of that storm. A masterless sword, a patched kit, a name that buys less each season. Across the water, China is under the Ming, still grand and busy with officials, but wrestling with corruption, coastal insecurity, and a hard rule that forbids private overseas trade, the Haijin, or sea ban. On paper, it defends order. In practice, it brews shadows. When law closes the gate, the tide finds a gap in the rocks. Dockside talk gives the shadows a name. Woko. People call them Japanese pirates, yet the label refuses to sit still. You hear of crews mixed from Japanese ronin, Chinese smugglers, Ryukyuan sailors, even the occasional Portuguese middleman with a long nose and an even longer matchlock. The mainstream fact is clear enough. In the mid-1500s, the raids surge, biting into Zhejiang and Fujian, and, on bold days, sliding inland along canals faster than garrisons can form ranks. A quirky detail slips into your ear the first week you haunt the piers. Those matchlocks that now glare from so many decks only reached Japan a few years ago, when a Chinese junk blew off course to Tanegashima. New sparks, new fires, and historians still debate the head count. How many raiders were truly Japanese? How many Chinese? And how much the name Woko was simply a convenient bucket for every coastal outlaw? You come to Hirado because hunger walks more honestly by the sea. Even on quiet days, the harbor smells of salt, tar, and chance. Your armor is a patchwork. Old iron scales, a repaired sleeve, sandals tied with cord. You carry a short bow, a sword whose binding you've rewrapped twice, and a face you keep still. You tell yourself you're looking for guard work, a clean convoy, a wage with no ghosts attached. Then a black-hulled junk glides in from the tide line, sails furled. Crates stamped in brush ink crowd the deck. A bosun barks at you to lend a hand. When you lift a chest, a sliver of metal winks through a split board the round mouth of a fire tube. You don't drop it. Someone notices you didn't. At the pier's end waits a man like a tide line, drawn in flesh-lean, neat beard, eyes that weigh profit and danger in one glance. He speaks Japanese with a coastal lilt and Chinese with the ease of a native. His name is Wang Zhu. Some call him merchant, some pirate, some quietly king. He studies the chip on your scabbard, the way you set your feet when the planks tilt, the hunger you try not to show. On land, he says, a blade decides today. At sea, the wind decides tomorrow. Not a threat, an invitation. You warm your hands around a bowl of sake steeped with ginger, while dock lamps bloom along the quay. You ask what the work pays. Wang Zhi answers with horizons. Silk packed tight as loaves, silver packed tight as beans, porcelain that sings when tapped, pepper that stings your eyes, and powder that coughs blue smoke. Routes from Hirado and the Godo Islands to hidden anchorages off Zhejiang, to a place the Chinese call Shuangyu Twin Islands, a market that blooms after dark. He speaks of escorts and diversions, of landing between patrol cycles, of towns where the richest houses sit a short walk from the water. He does not boast about safety. He promises movement. You sign on because the land has run out of doors. The monsoon turns, and ships like to ride south on its back. They give you a pallet between coils of rope. You watch the carpenter plug seams with hemp and pitch. The gunners dry match cord like noodles over a line. The navigators scratch stars on a board with chalk. You learn the rhythm of the pumps, the call and echo of commands, the way a sail talks when it's trimmed right. By night, the bay becomes a floating city, fishing fires pricking the dark like a second sky. Between watches, you trade stories with other drifters. One lost his stipend when his lord's rice failed. Another jumped ship at Satsuma. A third swears he reached Ryukyu on a fishing boat, living 3 days on pickled plums and stubbornness. Someone jokes that if heaven has gates, they're probably managed by customs officers. You laugh, because it's safer than admitting you're afraid. You keep your gear tidy, your bowstring dry, and your questions few. The first argument aboard isn't about loot or courage. It's about names. A new hand asks if you're proud to be Woko. An older sailor spits over the side. Pride is for shore folk. Out here, we're weather. We happen, then we're gone. You let the lines settle. Maybe that's what you are becoming. Not a title, not a class, just a pressure front sliding along a defended shore, making officials nervous and mapmakers busy. Before dawn, Hirado thins to a darker smudge and disappears. The junk noses into open water. The sail snaps full. The hull shivers, and your stomach lifts as if the sea were taking your weight for safekeeping. You tighten the strap on your sword, breathe the mix of tar and tide, and face the line where night softens. Somewhere beyond that rim stand watchtowers and salt pans and, if rumors hold, a young Ming commander whose troops march like a single brushstroke, Qi Jiguang. Somewhere, too, a market alley, where a voice you haven't met yet will change the route of your heart. For now, you stand where the bow narrows, wind in your sleeves, and let the spray choose your future. You are a Ronin, and the sea has just written your name in foam. The harbor at Hirado smells like salt, pitch, and a little bit of gambling, because every ship here is a bet. You step off a creaking gangplank with the light, careful tread of someone who owns nothing they can't carry. Your armor is a patchwork of repaired scales, your sword binding rewrapped twice, your bowstring kept dry in oiled cloth. The Sengoku wind blows off Kyushu's hills and tosses gulls in lazy circles. You look like any other Ronin hunting a day's pay, but your eyes keep drifting to the foreign rigs on the outer moorings, where opportunity knots its sails. On the pier, a black-hulled junk rides easy, its side painted with a bird in quick strokes of white. The crew is a mingled crowd, Chinese sailors shouting over rope coils, Japanese hands hauling casks, Ryukyuan boys quick on ladders. A mainstream fact first. The Ming Empire has long enforced the Haijin, the sea ban, choking private trade and nudging it into shadow. When demand doesn't die, it changes clothes. Smugglers trade silk for sulfur, salt for steel, and lately matchlocks. Here's a small oddity for your pocket. Sailors brag that the first arquebuses in Japan came when a storm-tossed junk drifted near Tanegashima, turning an island visit into an arms revolution. True or not, Powder Smoke now writes new grammar on the water. You shoulder one end of a crate when a voice calm, measured, asks if your back is as strong as your grip. You turn. A lean man with a neat beard regards you like a pilot reading stars. His Japanese is coastal but steady. His Chinese, when he answers a mate, is river smooth. I am Wang Zhi, he says, offering neither title nor apology, as if both are already understood. Some call him merchant. Others whisper pirate. You notice he lets the wind speak before he does. He walks you to the edge of the pier, where lantern light dances on black swells. He tells you what every hungry man wants and fears to hear. There is work. You will not guard rice in a lord's barn. You will move it where lords pretend rice does not go, between islands, behind headlands, through a midnight market. The Chinese call Shuangyu, twin islands. You listen without blinking. He notices that too. You bargain the way tired men do quickly, because time eats the poor. Pay is silver by the voyage, a bonus if a run lands hot. You ask about patrols. He lists river mouths and timings the way a monk might list sutras. You ask about crews. He admits what the docs already taught you. These woko are a mixed braid Japanese swords for shock, Chinese pilots for shoals, local carriers to melt into villages by dawn. And here's the line that stays soft around the edges. Historians still argue how Japanese those pirates truly were, how much the name became a basket into which every coastal outlaw was tossed. The argument doesn't feed you. The work might. By noon, you're aboard a messenger boat, bound for the Goto Islands, the first stepping stones in Wang Ji's sea road. Matsura men at Hirado nod you through. The clan likes its tolls regular, and its questions few. Another mainstream note slips in as you watch the oars bite. This channel, Hirado to Goto, has long been a hinge of unofficial exchange, a place where maps end but business begins. Wind lifts, canvas snaps, and the messenger thumps into its pace. You brace your knees and feel the keel's low hum, as if the boat were thinking aloud. On deck you learn the rope calls, the bucket rhythm, the small pieties of weather. A cook hands you rice that tastes faintly of smoke and kelp. You thank him like a man who remembers hunger. At dusk, the steersman jokes that if the gods run customs, their bribes are paid in incense and silence. You file it away, because you plan to live long enough to make bad jokes of your own. Night drops fast at sea. The stars come on like a city you forgot you loved. In the stern, Wang Ji joins you without ceremony. He sketches the coast in the air with 2 fingers. Sandbars here, a sheltered bight there, a watchtower whose garrison plays dice after midnight. He names buyers, salt factors, tea-men, brokers who keep 2 ledgers and 2 smiles. And finally, he names the risk growing on the Ming side of the ledger. A young officer drilling coastal troops until their boots hit the ground in the same beat. "Chi Jiguang," he says quietly, the way sailors say, shoal. You ask why he trusts a Ronin he met at noon. He doesn't bother with romance. "Because you watched the halyards before you watched my purse," he says. "And because you keep your questions short." You nod, trying not to show that your chest has finally loosened, as if someone cracked a window in a smoky room. Near midnight, the messenger noses into a cove where the water smells of pine roots and wet stone. A pinprick of fire winks twice from a beach, the agreed sign. You ride the skiff ashore. The sand is cold as old iron through your sandals. In a stand of lean pines, you find the first federation of Wang Ji's world, a makeshift camp of traders and guards who speak 3 languages and 1 grammar weight: speed, silence. Near the trees, bales of silk squat under oilcloth like sleeping boars. A cask leaks brine that could be tears or profit. You're handed a place on a coil of rope and a task list that begins before dawn soundings at the channel mouth, a sail patch, then a loadout under fog if the wind gods are in a lending mood. You stretch your shoulders, test your bow, retie your greaves. The sea says little, but you hear it anyway. Keep moving. Keep faith with wind and crew. Keep your blade dry and your name lighter than your kit. Under the pines, somebody hums a work song from Fujian, and a boy from Hirado tries to catch the tune. You close your eyes and let it wash through. Tomorrow you step from island safety into open water, bound for a market that blooms after curfew. From there, a darker gate waits Twin Islands and the black market channel that will carry you toward China's bright coasts and dimmer alleys. You breathe in tar and tide, count 3 heartbeats, and sleep as if the sea itself were holding you level. The first time I set eyes on the Goto Islands, they rose from the horizon like shards of jade piercing the restless sea. After weeks of sailing with Woko ships under Matsura's banners, my sense of direction was already unreliable. The currents around Kyushu played tricks on the mind, but Wako pilots knew these waters as if they had been born from them. The Goto chain lay far enough from the mainland to feel isolated, yet close enough to serve as the perfect way station for those who thrived in shadows. As our ship threaded through narrow straits between towering cliffs, the air thickened with the smell of salt, pine, and smoke from hidden hearths. No banners flew openly here. The Matsura clan had made these islands an unspoken harbor for smugglers, mercenaries, and ronin who could no longer return to the lands of their birth. Yet it was not chaos. The Goto Federation was a web of unspoken rules, a balance between lawlessness and control, enforced with the precision of a well-drawn sword stroke. We docked at a secluded inlet where jagged rocks served as natural breakwaters. Wooden piers jutted from the shadows of sea caves. As I stepped onto the planks, I felt the hum of covert activity, fishermen unloading crates that clearly held more than fish, merchants with guarded expressions trading bales of silk wrapped in tarred cloth, and armed guards, with the hardened faces of men who had survived many winters without allegiance to any lord. Wang Zhu was greeted like a visiting daimyo. His reputation here was not merely that of a pirate leader. He was a broker of peace among dangerous men. In the Goto Federation, survival depended on alliances more than brute force, and Wang Zhu had mastered that game. I followed him through the winding alleys of the harbor settlement, past tea houses that served rice wine to sailors, and shops where Chinese ceramics stood beside Japanese lacquerware, each piece a silent witness to the forbidden trade. Inside a low-roofed meeting hall, I met the council, a circle of Matsura envoys, Chinese traders, and seasoned sea captains. They spoke in a mixture of Japanese, Chinese, and Portuguese, each tongue slipping seamlessly into the next. Maps lay spread on the table, inked with currents, wind patterns, and coded symbols for safe anchorages and dangerous patrol zones. The Goto Federation operated like a shadow court. Disputes were settled here, prices agreed upon, and smuggling routes redrawn when the seas grew too dangerous. I kept silent, my role that of a watchful blade at Wang Zhi's side. Still, I absorbed every detail. I learned that the Federation's strength lay not in numbers, but in its invisibility. Official records never mentioned these harbors, yet from here flowed the lifeblood of our operations: muskets from the Portuguese, silk from Fujian, salt and rice from secret Chinese contacts, and, increasingly, silver, which spoke a language every merchant understood. At night, the harbor transformed. Lanterns floated on the tide, their reflections swaying like restless spirits. Gambling dens filled with the clatter of dice, and the sharp tang of grilled fish mixed with the perfume of women who knew how to make a man forget the risks of his trade. I drank sparingly, preferring to watch. In one corner, a Portuguese pilot argued prices with a Korean middleman. In another, two Japanese swordsmen compared their blades in a tense silence that could ignite into bloodshed with a single wrong word. It was here I first heard whispers of the next step, a black market far beyond these islands, where the stakes were higher and the profits greater. The name came quietly, almost reverently: Shuangyu, the Twin Islets. A hidden haven off the Chinese coast, where foreign ships could anchor without fear of imperial patrols, where the Ming's maritime prohibitions existed only as a distant threat. From Goto to Shuangyu ran an unbroken chain of trust and deception, and Wang Zhi intended for me to see it. Before we sailed, I stood on a cliff above the harbor, looking out over the moonlit sea. The Goto Islands felt like the heart of a living organism, its pulse beating in time with the tides. Here, men without masters found purpose. Here, borders blurred until it was impossible to tell pirate from merchant, exile from ruler. For the first time since becoming a ronin, I felt I had stepped into a realm where my blade had a place not in service to a single lord, but to the shifting, dangerous balance of the sea itself. Wang Ji joined me on the cliff, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "From here," he said, "the world is much larger than you imagine, and much more dangerous." His tone carried both promise and warning. I tightened my grip on my sword hilt, feeling the sea wind bite at my face. Whatever lay beyond these islands, Shuangyu, the black markets, the hidden war against the Ming's laws, I knew I was already bound to it. The next tide would carry us south, into waters where fortune and death sailed side by side. The sea wind that carried us from Goto to the Chinese coast was heavier now, as if it carried the scent of silver and gunpowder. Shuangyu was not marked on any official chart, yet its name was whispered by merchants, pirates, and smugglers alike. It was more than a port, it was a wound in the map, an open secret where law and commerce blurred into the same tide. We approached under moonlight. From afar, the harbor seemed like any fishing village dim huts, the flicker of oil lamps, but as we drew closer, I could see the silhouettes of masts jutting like a forest of spears. Ships from Japan, Ryukyu, and even Portuguese carracks loomed in the dark, their hulls heavy with goods never meant to see a customs seal. The pier was alive with silent urgency. Men moved crates wrapped in straw mats, avoiding the noisy clatter of wood on wood. The smell of dried fish mixed with the faint metallic tang of firearms. A young boy ran past me, carrying a bundle of matchlocks longer than his body. His bare feet barely made a sound on the damp planks. "Keep your eyes forward," Murakami, one of our senior ronin, muttered beside me. "Here, a wrong look can cost you a tongue." Inside the main warehouse, the black market revealed itself in full. Stacks of Chinese silk shimmered faintly even in the low lamplight. Chests of silver coins sat open, their contents gleaming like frozen drops of moonlight. Along the far wall, Portuguese traders bartered through translators with Japanese merchants, their pale faces flushed with wine and calculation. I had been in many ports before, but Shuangyu was different. Every transaction here was a gamble with the Empire's wrath, yet the air was thick with opportunity. I overheard a deal for 12 katanas in exchange for enough silk to clothe a daimyo's court. Another corner buzzed with the negotiation of saltpeter shipments, bound for forges that would birth more matchlocks. The risk was intoxicating. Our task that night was to escort a consignment of 30 matchlock guns from Goto's hidden caches to a Chinese intermediary known only as the Crane. He was a tall man in a plain robe, face unreadable, movements measured. The Crane never looked directly at me, yet I felt as though he had weighed my worth in a single glance. He inspected the weapons, testing the smoothness of the firing mechanisms, and finally nodded. "Payment will come with the tide," he said through a translator. I understood the meaning silver would change hands, only after the guns were beyond any hope of retrieval. While Murakami handled the formalities, I wandered toward the rear of the warehouse. There, I saw a group of Chinese women sewing fine embroidery onto bolts of silk. One looked up at me, her expression not of fear, but quiet appraisal. She bent back to her work without a word. I wondered if she knew where these silks would end up, perhaps in Kyoto, perhaps in Lisbon. The night wore on. Outside, more ships arrived, their crews blending into the shadows. A group of Portuguese sailors unloaded crates marked with strange symbols later. I learned they contained tin and lead shot. Nearby, a Chinese junk prepared to depart, its hold stuffed with rice and salt for Japanese buyers. It struck me how this single illegal port mirrored the entire ocean's greed. Everyone took something, everyone gave something, and no one kept clean hands. By the time our transaction concluded, the tide had begun to turn. We left Shuangyu without a word of farewell, as silently as we had arrived. The guns were gone. the silver hidden in false-bottom chests aboard our vessel. On deck, I looked back once. The lights of Shuangyu glimmered faintly against the horizon, a constellation born of contraband and ambition. Somewhere beyond that darkness lay the watchful eyes of Ming officials, and beyond them, men like Shu Hai and other sea lords who would kill for the lifeblood that flowed through ports like this. That night, I learned that a pirate's trade was not merely robbery on the waves. It was a careful dance of trust and betrayal, timed to the pull of the moon and the hunger of men. And in the shadows of Shuangyu, I felt the first pull toward a fate I could neither name nor escape. The voyage to Shuangyu took days, our small ship hugging the jagged coastline like a shadow afraid of the Sunday. The sea smelled of brine and tar, and the deck creaked under the restless weight of smuggled cargo rolls of Chinese silk wrapped in oilcloth, and wooden crates holding the cold promise of Portuguese arquebuses. These weapons, forbidden by Ming law, were worth a small fortune in the right hands, and every man aboard knew the price of being caught with them was death. Shuangyu itself was no ordinary harbor. It was an island village turned hive of illicit trade, a place where Chinese, Japanese, Portuguese, and even a few Malay sailors crossed paths without bowing to the laws of any empire. The black market was a living thing, smoke curling from cooking fires, voices in half a dozen tongues, and the sharp smell of dried fish and gunpowder. Stalls of silk brushed shoulders with barrels of saltpeter, and no one asked too many questions. Here, gold bought everything except safety. Under the guidance of Woko brokers, our cargo was offloaded in a moonless hush. Longshoremen in tattered headscarves moved like ghosts, rolling barrels into hidden cellars beneath taverns and temples. The arquebuses disappeared into the hands of intermediaries, men whose loyalties were as shifting as the tides. I was paid to watch, to learn the routes, from Portuguese traders to Japanese warlords, from Chinese silk merchants to the sea captains who risked everything for a share of the profits. At the heart of the market was a gambling hall, its wooden shutters thrown open to the damp night. Inside, the air was thick with pipe smoke and the clatter of dice cups. I saw men lose a year's worth of profit in a single hand, and others win enough to buy a ship before dawn. Woko captains met here under the guise of play, cutting deals over sake and salted squid. Information flowed with the liquor whispers of Ming patrols moving north, rumors of rival gangs plotting ambushes at sea. It was in this hall that I first heard the name Double Moon Passage, a secret waterway used to smuggle contraband between Shuangyu and the mouth of the Pearl River. Only a handful of navigators knew the reefs and shifting sands well enough to attempt it, and they guarded the knowledge like a blood oath. Woko ships would vanish into the night at high tide, and reappear days later with holds filled with rice, salt, and silver. One evening, I accompanied a small convoy bound for the passage. Our ships moved under a sky thick with stars, sails drawn low to hide from the moonlight. The sea was calm, but every man aboard carried tension like a blade at his ribs. Twice, we spotted lanterns bobbing on the horizon, Ming patrol junks, but they passed without seeing us. By dawn, we reached a sheltered inlet where fresh cargo awaited. Muskets from Macau, fine Ming porcelain, and medicinal herbs from Fujian. The return voyage was faster, but not without danger. A sudden squall scattered our formation, and one of the smaller junks vanished into the rain. We later learned it had been seized by Ming soldiers, its crew executed on the spot. The black market took no notice by nightfall. Business continued as if nothing had happened. Back in Shuangyu, I began to understand the delicate balance that kept this world turning. Every transaction rested on a knife's edge between profit and ruin. The Ming could crush it with a single decisive strike, but the corruption of officials, the greed of merchants, and the hunger of soldiers ensured its survival. For me, Shuangyu was both a refuge and a trap. The silver in my pocket bought warmth, food, and drink, but it also tied me to a world where death could come quietly in the dark. I was no longer just a wandering ronin. I had become a thread in the vast, tangled net of the Woko trade, and I knew that sooner or later that net would tighten around my throat. It began with a feast. In Shuangyu, the line between celebration and conspiracy was thin as a fishbone. The Woko leaders called it a gathering to honor the safe return of the Double Moon Passage convoy. The truth was more complicated. A man named Kuroda, one of the more feared captains, had returned from a voyage to Kyushu with news of a brewing war between rival clans. It meant more demand for muskets, more silver crossing the sea, and more danger for anyone caught in the middle. The hall was lit by rows of oil lamps whose smoke curled against the low rafters. Tables sagged under the weight of roasted pork, steamed fish, and rice wine strong enough to burn the throat. I sat near the back, as I always did, watching the captains drink themselves into laughter. Their faces glowed red in the lamplight, but their eyes narrow, sharp, never stopped measuring one another. At the center table, Kuroda placed a lacquered chest onto the planks with a hollow thump. He opened it to reveal a dozen gleaming matchlock muskets, each wrapped in oiled silk. Gasps rippled through the room. Even in Shuangyu, such a sight was rare. These, Kuroda said, will decide who rules the next 10 years of the sea. He was not speaking only of Japan. Everyone knew the muskets would be traded, stolen, and smuggled along the same routes that carried silver, saltpeter, and silk. The question was who would control the flow. That was when the blood oath was proposed. A scarred man named Li Dahu, one of the Chinese brokers, rose to his feet. His voice carried over the clatter of cups. Too many of us bleed alone. The Ming grow bolder. Patrols close in. If we are to keep the passage alive, we must swear to stand as one. A murmur of agreement swept the hall. In this world, loyalty was worth less than a silver tael until the moment you needed it. Then, it was worth everything. The ritual was simple and brutal. A shallow bronze bowl was placed on the table. Each captain pricked his finger with a dagger and let the blood drip into the wine inside. When it was my turn, I hesitated. The room seemed to tilt around me. The faces, the lamplight, the faint metallic scent of blood in the wine. My life was already tangled with theirs, but this was something different. This was binding. I pressed the blade to my fingertip. The sting was sharp, quick. A drop of blood slid into the bowl, blooming red in the cloudy rice wine. We drank in turn. The liquid was warm, almost sweet, but the taste clung to my tongue long after I swallowed. From that night forward, the blood oath bound us to defend the passage, to avenge one another if attacked, and to keep our trade routes secret under pain of death. But oaths have a way of turning men into both brothers and enemies. The first test came only days later. A smaller junk, commanded by a young captain named Bao Sheng, failed to return from a run to Zhoushan. Word spread that he had been taken by Ming forces. The oath demanded we act, but some argued it was too great a risk. Kuroda slammed his fist on the table. If we let them take him without consequence, they will take the passage next. Li Dahu's reply was cold. If we throw ships into their nets, they will hang us all. The hall split in two, those ready to fight, and those who saw only the gallows. That night, as the arguments raged, I slipped outside. The air was heavy with the smell of the tide going out. Across the water, lanterns bobbed on the decks of anchored ships. Somewhere out there was Bao Sheng, or his corpse. I realized then that the blood oath was not about unity. It was about leverage. Every man in that hall had just bound himself to a chain, and the first one to pull it would drag the rest into the deep. And in Shuangyu, there was always someone ready to pull. You leave the salt wind and slip from sea into river, where water smells of mud, duckweed, and cooking smoke. The pilots say the ocean breathes in long waves, but rivers whisper, "Miss one, and you run aground." Murakami taps twice on the gunwale crouch. Your skiff noses between reeds, and the world narrows to a corridor the width of 3 oars. On paper, your errand is clean. Guide 3 low boats up feeder canals, trade contraband for rice and legal papers, return before noon drums. In truth, it feels like threading a needle while the cloth moves. The pilots, brown as teak and wiry as rope, read water without speaking. One chews fennel seeds to smell, fresh currant under the sour of silt, a tiny oddity you pocket for later. By mid-morning, you are on the towpath, a line across your shoulder, sandals slipping on dew-slick clay. Dragonflies skim like blue glass. A woman rinsing greens notes your cloak, then decides you are nobody worth remembering. Inland people do danger differently. It must stand still before they name it. Here is the mainstream fact. This watery lattice is the Ming Empire's heartbeat. The Grand Canal carries grain north and policy south, and lesser veins feed granaries, depots, and markets. Close a gate, and a county coughs. Remember the map, not as lines, but as appetites. Near a low brick bridge, the lead boat grounds. You drop into the brown water, wedge planks beneath the keel, and heave until the hull sighs free. A boy offers a gourd of well water, giggles at your mud stripes, and sprints away. You grin. Harmless laughter means you still pass as harmless. The exchange town smells of soy, steam, and wet rope. Warehouses squat behind whitewashed walls. Your contact silk broker and survivor never says contraband. He produces papers instead. Salt certificates, rice receipts, travel tallies. With these, dirty cargo turns respectable by the time it reaches a magistrate. You sign a false name so carefully it almost feels true. Historians still argue how much inland piracy was raiding and how much collusion greased by bribes. A runner bursts from the alley. Patrol boat, 2 bends. You have seconds. Muskets vanish under reed mats. Match cords are dampened. Cabbage baskets spill across the deck. You shrug on a farmer's coat, drop your hat, and practice a slow, bored blink. The patrol glides past, counting cabbages. One officer squints at your hands, too steady, too clean, so you yawn and scratch. He moves on. Air returns to your lungs. Afternoon brings portage a relay over greased rails between shallow reaches. Townfolk arrive as if by scent. A work song in a Zhejiang lilt keeps time. An elder thanks you with 3 candied hawberries, tart enough to flip a switch in your skull. Tartness, you decide, is a kind of prayer. The last leg is a cypress-lined chute where the current grabs like a pickpocket. You post 2 archers forward, crouch by the tiller with Murakami, and trade short looks. A wrinkle betrays a buried snag. You flick the rudder, slide past with an inch to spare, and only then taste the iron ghost of fear. Dusk drops like a lid. In the inn yard, geese clatter and a dog resettles under a cart. You tally silver, divide rice tickets, set watches. The broker's daughter brings millet porridge and asks where you're from. The wind, you say, and she almost believes you. Another kitchen oddity. Boatmen swear a shaved coin under the bow keeps spirits from tangling the rudder. Murakami mutters shaved coins mostly please the man who shaved them. Before sleep, you climb to the roof. The canal glows like a stitched seam under the moon. From here, the Empire looks less like an enemy and more like a household. A drum thumps twice. Patrol shift. Somewhere beyond that sound, a young officer you haven't met drills a square of men until their feet answer like one body. His name moves along, water the way oil, rides soup thin, unmistakable, Qi Jiguang. You fold your cloak as a pillow, keep your bow within reach, and listen to the inn breathe spoons, whispers, arithmetic of sleep. Tomorrow you'll take the same path in reverse, a thread tugging treasure toward the sea. If fortune holds, you'll be a rumor by noon. If not, a lesson told low over wine. Either way, the river remembers every name that tries to cross it, and tonight it is learning yours. We had been following the river for days, the waterway narrowing as it wound through reed-choked banks. The winter wind from the north carried the smell of wood smoke and cooking rice from unseen villages. The men were restless. Even the veterans kept their hands near the hilts of their swords, for the tales about the Ming's new commander had already reached our ears. They said he was young but shrewd, a man who had drilled his soldiers into strange, impenetrable formations that no pirate charge could break. The first sign of his presence came with sound before sight, a low, rhythmic beat, like a great heart somewhere inland. At first, I thought it was the creak of oars, but as we pushed further, the cadence resolved into the steady thud of war drums. Each beat carried a weight that seemed to press upon the air. The boatman fell silent. We left the boats tied to a willow-shaded bank and climbed a muddy slope toward the sound. From the crest, the view opened. There, on a wide, flat plain beyond a belt of trees, stood the largest military camp I had ever seen. Neat rows of pale tents spread like an orderly village. Soldiers in crimson tunics moved in perfect synchronization, their spears glinting in the cold sunlight. "Yan Yan Jen," whispered one of our men, as if naming a spirit. I had heard of it. Qi Jiguang's famed Mandarin duck formation. From this vantage point, I saw its strange beauty. Squads of men locked into units of 12, each with roles defined: the spearman, the shield-bearer, the swordsman, the musketeer. They moved like one body, their shields overlapping, their spears thrusting as a wall. When they advanced, they did not rush in chaos like so many militia we had fought before. They flowed forward, pushing an invisible line before them. I scanned the ranks for their leader. At last, I saw him. A man on horseback, not far from the central pavilion, wearing a breastplate polished like dark water. He did not shout, nor wave his arms. Instead, he sat still, his gaze moving across the field with a calm that was somehow more commanding than any roar. Even from a distance, I felt the precision in his presence, as if he were already counting every weakness in the enemy he had yet to meet. The men around me shifted uneasily. To them, this was no ordinary Ming officer. This was a hunter who had studied his prey for months before springing the trap. I remembered the stories of his coastal campaigns further north, where pirate strongholds had fallen one by one under his relentless assaults. We did not linger long. The sun was dipping, casting long bars of shadow across the plain, and the drums had ceased. A trumpet call rolled across the camp, and the formations broke into smaller units, each moving toward the cooking fires. I watched the soldiers unstring their bows, their discipline intact even in the slow rhythm of evening. Back at the riverbank, one of our older companions spoke under his breath. "If that man turns his eyes toward us, we will have no place left to hide." I said nothing, but as we pushed the boats back into the current, the image of the camp clung to me. The neat lines of tents, the precise arcs of movement, the silent authority of the man on horseback, all of it was a world apart from our own loose brotherhood of blades and greed. We were quick, clever, unpredictable. He was the embodiment of order, grinding forward like the tide. That night, by the dim glow of the fire, I tried to sleep. Yet in my dreams, the steady drumbeat returned, chasing me through a fog of smoke and cries. No matter which way I turned, the formation was there, advancing, unbroken, spears leveled. And somewhere behind it, Qi Jiguang watched, silent, waiting. When I woke before dawn, the river mist curling low over the water, I knew this was only the first glimpse. The next time we crossed paths, it would not be from a distant hillside. The night before, the battle smelled of salt and smoke. Our small flotilla lay anchored behind a spit of jagged rocks, the sea hissing against them like some impatient serpent. Word had come from scouts. A detachment of Ming coastal troops, part of this famed Mandarin Duck Formation, had been spotted near a narrow beach 2 leagues east. They were guarding a shipment of grain and salt, exactly what we needed for our dwindling stores. At dawn, the fog clung low over the waves, shrouding our approach. I stood on the prow, my hand resting on the hilt of my worn katana. The others, hard-faced Ronin, half-starved sailors, and a handful of Portuguese gunners were silent, their breaths clouding in the chill air. The creak of the hull and the faint splash of oars were the only sounds. When we reached the inlet, the mist thinned, revealing a line of soldiers in lacquered armor, shields locked tight. They moved with a precision I had never seen among coastal militias. Long spears glinted, angled forward, flanked by musketeers kneeling in perfect formation. Behind them, a young officer stood calm, unflinching, his gaze fixed on us, like a hawk sighting prey. The first volley cracked like thunder. Musket balls tore into the water around our boats, sending up plumes. We leapt into the shallows, the cold biting into our legs. I charged with 3 others, cutting through the gaps between shields. For a brief, glorious moment, steel rang against steel, the rhythm of battle thrumming through my arms. Then came the counter-strike. The soldiers moved as one, their front line yielding just enough to draw us in before snapping shut like a trap. Spears stabbed from all angles. My comrade to the left went down with a cry, blood blooming in the surf. I slashed at a spear shaft, breaking it, but another jab toward my ribs. I barely twisted away. A sudden roar of drums and gongs signaled their push. We were outnumbered, outmaneuvered. The officer's commands cut through the chaos, and his troops flowed forward like a tide. We fell back toward the boats, firing our own muskets in ragged bursts to buy seconds. The retreat was ugly men slipping in the shallows, arrows whistling past, the sea red in places where the wounded thrashed. I was the last to leap aboard, my chest heaving, salt water and blood mingling on my tongue. As we pulled away, I looked back at the shore. The officer stood there still, hands clasped behind his back, watching us vanish into the mist. His calm, unshaken presence burned into my mind. That day, I learned the difference between a brawl and a battle. We had been fighting like wolves. They fought like an unbroken wall. It was not just defeat, it was a wound to my pride. And deep in my gut, I knew this would not be the last time I faced him. The sea between us would not wash away the need for reckoning. 2 weeks after our bitter retreat, the winds carried us north to Ninghai, a port city whose narrow lanes twisted like the knots in an old rope. We came not as raiders this time, but as shadows. The fleet needed rest, supplies, and above all, information about the Mandarin Duck Formation. The harbor was choked with fishing junks and grain barges. We anchored beyond the watchtowers, slipping ashore in small groups under the guise of traders. My hair was tied in the manner of southern merchants, my sword hidden in a bamboo case. In crowded markets, anonymity was easy faces blurred in the steam of food stalls and the shouts of haggling. But I felt eyes on me more than once. Ninghai had the scent of fear. Locals spoke in low voices about coastal patrols tightening their grip. The young officer I had faced on the beach was said to be here, overseeing training. His name reached me in a tea shop, whispered between sips. Li Zhang. They called him the Wall, for he had never been breached in open combat. That night, I followed a narrow canal into the district where the barracks stood. Lanterns swayed over the gates, casting pools of gold on the water. Through a gap in the wall, I watched his troops drilling, even at this late hour. The precision was unnerving. No wasted steps, no hesitation. As I turned to leave, a figure stepped from the shadows. She was slender, dressed in a plain indigo robe, but her stance was firm. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly in accented Japanese. "They already know you've come." Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, searched my face as if weighing whether I was worth saving. Before I could answer, the sound of boots striking stone echoed from the alley behind me. She grabbed my sleeve and pulled me through a side door into a courtyard choked with drying nets. We wove through passageways until the noise faded. Only then did she speak again. "If you want to defeat Li Jung, you'll need more than blades. You'll need to understand his mind." She handed me a folded scrap of paper, maps of the shoreline, marked with strange symbols. "Meet me at the Western Pier in 3 nights." She disappeared into the warren of streets before I could ask her name. I tucked the paper inside my robe, my pulse still quick from the chase. Somewhere in the maze of Ninghai, enemies were closing in. Yet for the first time since that defeat on the beach, I felt the faint spark of an advantage. 3 nights could change everything, or end me entirely. The moon hung low over the quiet fishing village, its pale light spilling across the narrow lanes like silver dust. The night air smelled of salt and drying seaweed, a scent that clung to the skin and made every breath feel as though it had been carried across leagues of ocean. I walked slowly through the shadows, my sandals brushing against the damp earth, the rhythmic whisper of waves somewhere beyond the houses guiding me like an old memory. She was waiting where we had agreed at the edge of the pier, where the planks groaned with each small movement of the tide. Her figure stood still against the open horizon, hair swaying in the breeze. I had seen her many times before in the bustle of the market, in fleeting glances and stolen moments. But tonight her presence was different, more fragile, yet more certain, as if the darkness itself had decided to shield her. When she turned, the light from a lone paper lantern caught her face. There was no smile this time, only a quiet resolve in her eyes. I stepped closer, the sound of my own footsteps loud against the wood. We stood so near that I could feel the warmth radiating from her, even in the cool wind. "You should not be here," she said softly, though her voice carried an edge of relief. "They say the sea will be restless tonight. Bad things follow restless tides." I almost laughed at her choice of words, but my chest was too tight. "Bad things follow me everywhere," I answered, "but I couldn't leave without seeing you." She lowered her gaze, fingers tightening around the shawl draped over her shoulders. For a moment, the world shrank to the sound of water slapping against the pier and the creak of ropes on a moored junk. Somewhere, far out in the bay, a bell rang a signal to ships anchored beyond sight. I knew it meant movement, perhaps even danger. We spoke of small things at first, as if by avoiding what truly weighed on us, we might keep it from becoming real. She told me the fishing had been poor this week. I told her of rumors that the authorities were tightening patrols along the coast. But beneath our words ran an unspoken current we both knew our worlds were moving toward collision. When I reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. Her fingers were cold, yet they closed firmly around mine, as though trying to memorize the shape of my grip. "If the wind turns, you must promise me you'll leave," she whispered. "Go far. Don't look back." "I have never been good at leaving," I said, and I saw her lips tremble. Her other hand rose to my face, palm warm against my cheek. I leaned into it without thinking, my eyes closing for the briefest second. The air between us felt impossibly heavy, thick with all the things we could not change, all the futures we could not claim. The sound came suddenly, distant shouts, muffled but urgent. Somewhere beyond the houses, the faint glow of torches flickered. My body tensed, the way it always did when danger approached. She felt it too. Her hand fell away from my face, and her gaze shifted to the shoreline. "They're looking for you," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "And they'll keep looking." The pause that followed was longer than I could bear. Finally, she stepped forward, closing the last space between us, and pressed her lips to mine. The kiss was not desperate, but deliberate, as if sealing something unspoken between us. When she pulled away, her eyes held the moonlight, bright and unyielding. "You will come back," she said. Not an order, not a plea, but a fragile truth she needed to believe. I didn't answer. Instead, I stepped back into the shadows, the shouts growing louder in the distance. The pier, the sea, the silver light, all of it began to fade behind me as I melted into the winding lanes. But her touch lingered on my skin, and the taste of her words stayed on my tongue. I knew the tides would soon change, and when they did, neither of us would stand where we were tonight. The monsoon winds shifted early that year, and with them came whispers that traveled faster than any ship. I was in Hirado's inner harbor, repairing the haft of my yari, when the news reached us not in a loud proclamation, but in the half-lowered voices of merchants, fishermen, and wandering monks. Wang Ji's name had begun to sour in the mouths of men who once toasted his health. It began subtly. Cargoes delayed without explanation, trusted captains quietly defecting to rival fleets. Silver payments arriving light, their balance replaced with vague promises. And then, more chilling still, the occasional ship long expected, simply vanishing somewhere between Kyushu and the Zhoushan archipelago. The sea has always taken her due, but this felt deliberate, the work of hands in the dark. I had been with Wang Ji long enough to know his strengths and his flaws. He was a master of negotiation, able to charm a Buddhist abbot one day and an outlaw chieftain the next. Yet, he trusted in loyalty the way a gambler trusts a lucky dice. He forgot that in our trade, loyalty bends with the wind, and the wind was shifting. In a smoky backroom of a Hirado tea house, I heard more than I wanted. Two men from Satsuma, ostensibly traders, spoke in veiled tones about an arrangement between certain Ming officials and Japanese daimyo, eager to close the pirate problem once and for all. They said the Ming court had sent covert envoys, offering bribes and titles to those who could help fracture Wang Ji's network. Even the Portuguese, with their own designs on the China trade, were said to be smiling too politely at his table these days. One night, Wang Zhu summoned a handful of us to his quarters. His face was shadowed by the lamplight, his voice steady but edged with strain. He told us that a faction in the Ming court had been persuaded he was beyond redemption, that they now sought not negotiation, but annihilation. He spoke of false letters circulating, accusing him of selling secrets to Japanese warlords and plotting rebellion in Fujian. "I am no saint," he admitted. "But this is poison meant to drive a spear between me and every ally I have left." It was then I understood. This was not a sudden betrayal, but a patient campaign, orchestrated to corrode trust until even his closest lieutenants doubted him. Some already had. I saw it in the glances exchanged when he turned away, in the hesitations before men pledged their agreement. Still, the fleet moved. Cargoes of silk and gunpowder were loaded for the next run to the Wuzhou coast. Yet I felt the tension, like the tremor in a drawn bowstring. Each port we entered seemed colder in its welcome. In the 5 islands, the Matsura clan received us with ceremonial courtesy, but their eyes slid toward the floor whenever Wang Ji spoke of future ventures. In the markets of Goto, whispers followed us like gulls trailing a blood trail in the water. One evening, after an exchange of goods with smugglers in the East China Sea, I found a note tucked into the bindings of my weapon chest. Written in a careful Chinese hand, it warned, "Leave while you can. The tide that carried him will drown all who stand near." There was no signature, only a faint scent of incense clinging to the paper. I burned the note, but the words stayed with me. I was not a man of easy fears, yet the sea had taught me to read the signs, currents changing, skies darkening in the distance. The plot against Wang Zhu was no longer a rumor. It was a net tightening around us, thread by thread, and when such a net is drawn, it cares little for who the fish are. By the time we set sail for the next rendezvous off Ningbo, I knew the truth. The coming storm would not be fought with swords alone. It would be fought in the shadows, in the hearts of men, and in the unseen hands that decide who lives to sail again. And storms like that rarely leave any ship untouched. The sea was unnervingly calm as we neared Ningbo, the kind of flat stillness that makes a sailor uneasy. A gray dawn light hung over the water, and even the gulls seemed reluctant to cry. Wang Zhu stood at the prow, his eyes fixed on the faint outline of the coast. None of us spoke much. Word had reached us days earlier that our partners inland were growing restless, and now every man aboard knew this meeting could be our last under friendly skies. We anchored off a small inlet, as planned, and sent 2 boats ashore to signal our arrival. The signal returned from the beach was correct, 3 lanterns in a staggered line, but something about their rhythm felt wrong, too precise, too rehearsed. The first hint of betrayal came not from the Ming officials, but from our own crew. A young gunner named Fei, barely 20, slipped away during the unloading. When we found him again, he was coming back from the tree line, claiming he'd been relieving himself. His hands smelled faintly of sulfur and oil powder that wasn't ours. I caught his eye, and for a moment, I thought he'd confess. Instead, he muttered something about damp powder in the forward hold and hurried away. By midday, the welcoming party arrived. 2 Ming envoys, a small escort of soldiers in plain armor, and a handful of port officials. On the surface, it was all formality bows, measured words, polite smiles. Yet the soldiers' spears were too sharply polished for mere ceremony, and they kept shifting their weight like men waiting for a signal. Wang Zhi handled the opening negotiations with his usual poise. He spoke of mutual benefit, of stable trade routes, of resolving past misunderstandings. But the envoy's replies had the dull, pre-written feel of a script, as if the outcome had already been decided somewhere far from this windswept shore. Then, just as one of the port officials poured tea, I noticed movement at the far edge of the inlet. A second group of soldiers, at least 40, was filtering through the mangroves, moving in staggered pairs. Their armor was mismatched, suggesting they'd been assembled quickly from nearby garrisons. That was when I understood. The meeting was the bait, and we were already inside the trap. I edged closer to Wang Zhu and murmured what I'd seen. His jaw tightened, but he did not break his tone. Instead, he lifted his cup, took a long, deliberate sip, and began to speak of the tea itself, its origin, its subtle bitterness. It was a stalling tactic, and one I'd seen him use before when the air grew dangerous. While the words flowed, he flicked his gaze toward our quartermaster, a silent signal to prepare the ships. I slipped away under the guise of fetching trade manifests, but in truth, I went to the shore to signal our boats. The rowers caught my hand gestures and began loading with deliberate slowness, trying not to draw attention. But the soldiers in the mangroves were moving faster now. A captain's voice barked an order, sharp and final. The polite shell of negotiation shattered in an instant, spears lowered, bows drawn, boots pounding against wet sand. I ran back toward Wang Zhi, drawing my blade as shouts erupted from every side. Smoke burst from the tree line where Fei had disappeared earlier. The powder he'd left was now ignited. A distraction or a signal, I could not tell. Amid the chaos, I saw the glint of steel arcing toward Wang Ji's back. I cut the attacker down before his blade could land, but more were coming, from every direction. The Ming envoys had stepped well aside, their faces unreadable, as if they were merely witnesses to a storm they themselves had summoned. We fought our way toward the boats, the surf churning red around our ankles. Not all of us made it. When we finally pushed off from the shore, arrows hissed past us, some thudding into the gunwales, others striking men who toppled silently into the water. As the oars bit into the sea, I looked back once. Wang Zhu stood in the stern, his face pale but set, his eyes fixed not on the soldiers or the burning shoreline, but somewhere beyond at enemies we could not yet see, but who had already marked the next move in this game. The trap at Ningbo had failed to kill him, but it had succeeded in something else. It had stripped away any illusion that the sea could keep us safe. From now on, every port, every wind, every friendly face would have to be doubted. And in our world, that kind of doubt was a slow, certain poison. Drums roll inland like low thunder, and you know before anyone speaks that a new hand is on the board. Word passes along the beach in half whispers. Qi Jiguang has the seal, the mandate, the food, the drums. You shoulder your pack, taste salt in the wind, and follow others to a dune above the estuary, where reeds tremble. Below, soldiers assemble without fuss. 12-man squads knit into blocks, shields overlapping, spears angling like reeds in a current. A boy beside you breathes, Yan Yan Jen, and you nod because the shape is familiar now, files that do not chase glory, only ground. Mainstream fact. Qi trains coastal troops until they move like joined knuckles. Raids that once scattered militias now crash against something that refuses to break. You watch the warm-ups. Rattingent shield men crouch, swordsmen pivot behind, arquebusiers lift barrels in rhythm prime. Seat, touch, withdraw. A quirky detail rides the breeze. Recruits stamp to the beat on boards buried in sand, so cadence hums through their legs. The habit follows onto boats and bridges. Nearby hangs the thorned, Langshan wolf brush, meant to snag blades and courage at once. Orders ripple, and the blocks unfold toward the salt pans that once fed your night work. You taste the old route, the shallow bar where you dragged skiffs, the gap in the dike you never told new boys about. It is noted now under a clerk's brush. Trumpets lift, watchfires answer in relays. You murmur, he is stitching the coast. Murakami grins. And we are the tier. Your task today is measure, not glory. You shadow the advance, counting drum beats, noting how long a squad wheels, who carries spare powder where pack mules rest. A runner nearly stumbles over your hide. You flatten, smell fennel on his sash, and file it another small system, breath kept sharp in drills. By noon, the camp stands where your hidden cove used to be. Kitchens blossom first, rice, greens, fish soup order grown from flame. You feel reassured and threatened by the same efficiency. A fisherman swears Qi bans gambling on drill days and hands out vinegar water so men don't swoon. You almost smile at the homely logic. Historians still debate the mix you fight. How many raids are truly Japanese? How many Chinese crews wear your name to win fear or budget? On days like this, the question feels scholarly and far. Down here, a wall is a wall, no matter who paints it. Afternoon brings a test of edges. Your skiff noses into a side creek where a grain shed crouches under reeds. The plan is a needle slip, snatch ledgers, slide back before the cord tightens. You wade, water cool around your knees, ease the latch with a stick wrapped in cloth. Inside, tally books wait like domestic animals. A shadow crosses the doorway. The wall opens into rattan and iron. They do not shout. A shield closes your lane. The wolf brush lifts like a thatch of thorns. The drill you watched from the dune repeats at arm's length. Your blade scratches rattan and pride. You backflow, not running, simply folding along the creek as if this were always the plan. Murakami covers with 2 shots that lift more mud than fear, and you are water again. At dusk you count the day. Losses, a ledger unread, a route burned, a safe cove turned parade ground. Gains, the cadence between drum and wheel, the vinegar water, the distance a runner covers before breath frays. You whisper it into memory like weather. Night brings soft laughter in their camp and stiff silence on your beach. You lie on an upturned skiff, watch sparks rise like a second constellation, and admit the shape of coming months. Chi will not rush. He will press. He will wear the shore like a boot wears leather. Your world, once wind and odds, is becoming arithmetic inputs, outputs, margins that shrink when you pause. So you do not pause. Before moonrise, you send 2 boys upriver with stories for the wrong ears and a coin purse. You shift caches, scuttle a skiff, smear a false channel into the marsh. When the tide turns, you sleep in your clothes, blade under palm, telling yourself that living to fight isn't running, that retreat is a lesson, and lessons become tools. The drums are quiet now. The sea says nothing back. You close your eyes and rehearse the wall, not to fear it, but to measure it tomorrow until you find the seam knuckles must hide. The wind off the East China Sea had changed. For weeks, the air had been heavy with salt and the scent of tar, but now it carried the faint, acrid smoke of burning villages far along the coast. From the deck of our ship, I watched black plumes rise on the horizon, silent messengers of a war that had already decided our fates. The raids had grown desperate, the profits thin. Even the most hardened pirates whispered that the tide had turned. She had not come to the harbor that morning. In past months, no matter the danger, she would meet me among the baskets of fish and bolts of silk, a veil hiding her face from the soldiers and merchants alike. This time, the pier felt too wide, too exposed without her. I walked its length, searching for her figure among the crowd, but all I found was the creak of rope and the slap of water against hulls. By midday, the truth reached me in hushed words from a boy who had once run messages for our crew. Soldiers had come to the marketplace, not in force, but with a surgeon's precision, asking after certain names, certain faces. They had taken her away, he said, though no one dared see where. My vision blurred for a moment, not with tears, but with the sudden cold clarity that all the promises we made beneath the moonlight had been written in salt water. The crew wanted to sail immediately. Rumor had it that the Ming Navy, under the iron hand of General Qi Jiguang, was closing in from the east. Others claimed rival pirates had sold our routes in exchange for amnesty. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. The networks we once relied on were fraying like rotten rope. That night, I sat alone on the gunwale, the ship rocking gently beneath me. Memories came unbidden, her laugh in the narrow alleyways of the port, the way her hands lingered on mine when we passed a bowl of tea. The sea had brought us together, but it was also the sea that tore us apart, scattering us like driftwood. Somewhere inland, she might still be alive, waiting, or perhaps cursing my name. I would never know. When dawn broke, the decision was made for us. A flotilla of Ming war junks appeared on the horizon, their sails black against the rising Sunday. We cut anchor and ran before the wind, the decks alive with shouted orders and the thud of feet. Cannon thundered behind us, splinters flying as iron balls punched through our stern. I saw men I had sailed with for years vanish into the churning wake. By nightfall, we had slipped into the open sea, but the victory was hollow. Word reached us that Wang Zhu's fleet had been shattered, his alliances broken, his name now a curse among both pirates and merchants. With his fall, there was no longer a place for men like me. I stood at the bow, staring into the endless dark. Somewhere ahead lay Hirado, the island where my wandering began. I thought of returning not as a warrior, not as a lover, but as something smaller, humbler. Perhaps I could fade into the alleys of the port, another nameless soul among the tide of exiles. The sea whispered around the hull, its voice neither kind nor cruel. I realized then that I had never truly belonged to her, nor she to me. We had only borrowed each other for a brief, violent season, and now the debt had come due. When the moon rose high, silvering the waves, I let the last image of her drift away the way she had looked at me that final night, as if she already knew. The horizon ahead was empty, but in its emptiness, there was a strange kind of peace. The pirate was gone, only the man remained. The waters around Hirado smelled different from any other port brine, mixed with pine resin drifting down from the forested hills, a scent I had carried with me in memory for years. When our battered ship limped into the bay, the familiar outlines of tiled rooftops appeared through the mist, and for the first time since leaving, I felt the weight in my chest ease. We anchored far from the main quay, avoiding the eyes of officials who might remember old warrants. The crew dispersed quickly, some to taverns, some to ships bound for other riskier waters. I walked alone along the narrow road into town, past the shrines where paper lanterns swayed in the damp wind. Every step felt like peeling back layers of a life I had shed, but never truly escaped. Hirado had changed. The streets were busier, not with fishermen and traders as before, but with armed guards in lacquered armor, their spears catching glints of gray light. New warehouses had risen along the waterfront, their gates painted with the crests of merchants from Kyoto and Nagasaki. The air carried a sharper edge, less laughter, more orders barked across the market. I went first to the house where my father had once kept a shop selling rice wine. The shutters were closed, the sign weathered and unreadable. A neighbor told me the place had been sold years ago, after word reached town that my father had died at sea. They had assumed I was gone too, swallowed by the same waves. In a way, they weren't wrong. With nowhere else to go, I found a room above a tea house. The landlady was too busy counting coins to ask questions, and I was grateful. At night, I would sit by the small window, watching fishing boats return under the moonlight. The rhythm of their work was steady, almost holy, so unlike the chaos I had lived. Yet the past was not done with me. Within a week, I saw a familiar figure in the marketplace, a man who had once served as an interpreter during our dealings with Chinese merchants. He did not smile when he recognized me. Instead, he pulled me into the shadow of an alley and whispered that certain officials in Hirado still remembered my name. They would not forget my years under Wang Ji's flag, nor the raids we had launched against Japanese and Chinese ships alike. The smart thing would have been to leave again, to vanish before the noose tightened, but my legs refused. Hirado was not just a port. It was the last place where I could still pretend to be something other than a fugitive. One evening, as rain traced silver lines down the window, I found myself writing her name on a scrap of paper. I did not know if she was alive, or if she had been broken by the interrogators. I only knew that every time the harbor bells rang, I half expected to see her stepping off a boat, her eyes searching the crowd for mine. But the tide waits for no one, and in Hirado, I was learning that neither did time. It was early spring when the messenger arrived, his sandals caked with mud from the coastal road, his sleeves smelling faintly of smoke. I had been sitting in the tea house's back room, sipping a thin, bitter brew, when the landlady slid open the door and told me someone was asking for the man who walks the harbor at night. The description was mine, though I had not known it had become a name. The messenger was young, perhaps not yet 20. his hair tied high in the style of Nagasaki apprentices. He carried no sword, only a small oilskin pouch slung across his chest. His eyes darted to the corners of the room before he Saturday. Without a word, he reached into the pouch and withdrew a folded paper, sealed with a blob of dark red wax. The crest, stamped into the wax, was unfamiliar. 3 waves enclosed within a circle. "From Nagasaki," he said. "I was told to place it in your hands only." I waited until he left before breaking the seal. The paper inside was thick, the brushstrokes deliberate and unhurried. It contained only 12 characters, but they pulled the ground from under my feet. "The one you seek sails for Hirado before the next full moon." There was no signature, no mark of origin beyond the seal, but I knew the one could only mean her. And if she was coming to Hirado, it would not be for reunion, not after what we had both endured. The next days blurred. I found myself pacing the harbor, noting every ship that docked, every crew that unloaded crates under guard. My old acquaintance, the interpreter, warned me again to disappear, muttering that certain officials had begun asking questions about strangers renting rooms in town. But I could not leave. I had lived too long with questions gnawing my sleep. Here, perhaps, was an answer. On the 7th night after the message, a storm rolled in from the west. Fishing boats scurried for shelter, their sails snapping in the wind. I stood beneath the eaves of a closed warehouse, scanning the rain-streaked horizon. That was when I saw it. A single junk, its sails dark with wet, pushing stubbornly toward the quay. Even at a distance, I could feel the will behind its progress, as though the ship itself refused to yield. When the vessel moored, I kept to the shadows. The gangplank lowered, and figures began to disembark: merchants, sailors, a pair of porters carrying a lacquered chest. Then she appeared. She wore a hooded cloak, the fabric heavy with rain. The lamplight caught her profile for only a heartbeat, but it was enough. The curve of her cheek, the firmness of her jaw, it was her. And yet she did not look for me. She moved with the certainty of someone who already knew where she was going. I followed, careful to keep the wind between us, knowing that whatever lay ahead would decide more than whether we spoke again. It might decide whether either of us left Hirado alive. The night draped itself like a length of silk, unspooling slowly from the harbor and settling over rooftops and narrow streets. The wind moved without hurry, carrying the damp breath of the sea, slipping through cracks, swaying the small flames of paper lanterns until they trembled. Far away, the sound of waves spoke in whispers, telling a story no one could fully understand, but everyone could feel. I leaned against the wooden window frame and watched the crossroads empty. Footsteps grew softer, hooves faded to a gentle rhythm, as if the whole town had agreed not to disturb the dreams already forming behind closed shutters. My own breathing slowed. The heart, too, found a quieter beat. Time stretched like a thin silver thread between my fingers, gliding smoothly and without resistance. In this hour, the world held no sharp edges, only soft curves. Unanswered questions and yet to arrive answers rested together in the folds of darkness, waiting for a dawn they knew would come. There was no need to wait quickly, no need to fear losing your way. The sea would still be here, the streets would still know your steps, and the light would return when it was ready. Close your eyes now. Let the tide keep watch for you. Let the stars remember your name. You are safe in the dark, and the night is deeper than your worries. Sleep, as if the world is breathing with you, and you with it. Good night.